Hello and welcome to another Excel VBA tutorial. So we're kicking off a new series today. This series we're going to be covering the Power Pivot Object Model. So a lot of people sometimes are surprised to hear this, but you can actually control the Power Pivot add-in using Excel VBA. However, with that being said, if you go online right now, you will find a lot of examples on there, but they are almost always using the old method and they're very limited in what they can do. So Microsoft, a couple years ago, I believe, or something like that, they actually created a whole separate object model that was related to Power Pivot. For whatever reason, either it was not advertised well or something, but for whatever reason, I cannot find any examples on it. It's the strangest thing on the planet. And so this series, I'm going to be using the documentation that they technically have, because any of the things that you would want to be able to do with Power Pivot, you have to use this new object model. So this video is going to be broken a little bit differently today. I'm going to go read over some documentation first. We're going to come back to our Excel workbook, and then we're going to kind of explain how my data has been laid out. So with that being said, I'm going to go into Chrome. I already have a window open. And then from here, I am currently on the Microsoft Docs website. So this has all the documentation resources about different Microsoft products for developers and things like that. One we're concerned about is the Office VBA Reference. So if you ever want to learn about the Excel object model, you just go to the Office VBA Reference, you go down to Excel, and then you see a couple different sections. One is concepts. So those are kind of like more broad examples, or more kind of examples broken into sections. Object model, so this is all the individual objects you can potentially play with. It's very important you read through some of those sometimes. And then there's this other section, I can't remember what this one is for. Oh, it's collections, enumerations, and stuff like that. So again, more important stuff you might want to read through. In our example, if you wanted to learn about Power Pivot, you go on concepts, and then there's this little section at the top called about the Power Pivot model object in Excel. And then if you look here, it came out in 2017. For whatever reason, I don't know if it was never advertised well or something, but there are almost no examples online. It's very interesting. But basically what it does is it talks about Power Pivot a little bit, talks about relationships, working with data sources and stuff like that. It just keeps scrolling down, and then you're going to come here, the Power Pivot model object model. So this will talk about the individual objects that we can play with inside Excel VBA and all their properties and methods associated with them. Now, at the top of this object model is the model itself. And so the first one they talk about is the actual Power Pivot model. They describe all the properties, and then they do it a little bit differently than the other documentation. But basically, they talk about each individual method. They have a little paragraph that explains it, and then they talk about what is it, the name of it, if it's required or not, a workbook connection, and then a description. So very important you read through this, because unfortunately this is your only resource at this time. I encourage you read through all of this, learn about the different objects, learn about the different collections, learn about the different methods and properties, and you will find that it's actually not too bad working with any of this stuff. But it does take a little bit getting used to it first, because a lot of it is new, and unfortunately this is kind of our only resource at this point. But now you have my videos too, so look at it like that. You at least have some examples that are visual based. Okay, so with that being said, I'm going to jump in my Excel workbook again. From here, I want to just talk about my data a little bit. I currently have two Excel tables inside my workbook. One is called price data, and the second one is called sales data. My goal is to load the sales data table into my Power Pivot model, and then we're going to just create one metric. Sorry, not one metric, one measure. And we can think of a measure as kind of basically like an aggregation. So it would be something like, hey, I want to measure the total transaction count, or I want to measure the total, or the maximum transaction count, or something like that. It's basically like a measure. It's a metric that we can use in order to kind of summarize our data. So from here, now that we kind of understand how the tables are laid out, it's very important to understand that we have named our tables. That comes in handy. I'll explain why later. But now that we've done that, let's jump into our VBA editor. So we're going to go up to our Developer tab. We're going to go to our Visual Basic icon. And then from here, if you haven't already, you would want to make sure you right click, insert module to insert a new module. You want to make sure it's inside the workbook that you're working with. You don't want to put this in a personal macro workbook. It's not going to really work in those kind of examples because your Power Pivot model lives within inside of your particular Excel workbook. Now, that's not technically saying you couldn't do it. I'm sure you could, because reading through some of the documentation, you kind of could. I wouldn't recommend it though. I would really try to, at this point, let's keep it simple, keep it smart, and put it in the actual workbook itself. From here, we can create a new subroutine. We'll call it sub power pivot. Put our brackets. First thing we're going to do is we're going to declare our variables. Almost all of them, in fact, all of them are going to be actual Power Pivot model objects. And so what we're going to do is we're going to declare our variables. First one is going to be called my model. This will reference Power Pivot itself. Now, this is simply a model object. So a model object is Power Pivot. Each workbook can have their own model. From here, what we're going to do is we're going to create another variable. It's going to be called my model table. Your model can have tables inside of it. So it has a collection of tables. So there's something called model tables. That is the collection of all the tables in your model. And then if you want, you can create a reference to a single table. Now, in this example, I'm going to do a single table. So I'm going to say model table object. So an individual table inside my Power Pivot model. Now, if you look down here below, you'll see model tables. That's the collection of all the tables in your particular Power Pivot model. But we don't need all of them. We just need one. And then from here, what we're going to do is we're going to create a reference. We're going to call it, we're not creating a reference. We're declaring an object variable. It's called my model measures. This is a collection of all the measures in my particular Power Pivot model. So it's going to be model measures. Those are the only three variables we need at this point. Now that we've done that, let's create a connection to my data model and add my sales data table to our Power Pivot model. So we're going to add a connection and load the sales data table into Power Pivot. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to this workbook, so the workbook that contains this code. We're going to go into the connections collection, so these are all the connections that live in this workbook, and we're going to call add to. The add to will create a special type of connection that actually will allow us to create a connection to Power Pivot, so we're going to use add to in this example. In fact, I think it's the only one that you can use for at least the connections collection. And then from here, there's a couple parameters that we need to pass through. The first one is the name of our connection. I'm going to call it sales underscore dataset. Something simple. I'll put a comma, space, underscore, tab, 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 tab. And then from here, I can put a description. And then this one is going to say this is all the sales data from my bakery set. Perfect. And then from here, we need to pass through the connection string. The connection string, well, our particular connection in this example, so your connection string changes depending on the data source you're working on. In our specific example, we are referencing a connection that is related to a worksheet. And so what we're going to do is we're going to put through a string. The first one is going to be called worksheet, all uppercase. And then we need to say where this worksheet lives. Where does this particular worksheet that we're going to pull data from, where does it live? Well, it lives in this file that we're currently in. So I need to pass through the file path to this particular file. So I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm going to go back to my workbook. I'm going to go to File, Info, Copy Path. And that's it. And then from here, I'll pass through my path right here. And now I have my connection string. It's as simple as that at this point. From here, what happened? Oh, I need to put my comma and then my underscore, go to the next line. From here, we need the command text. This is kind of like the actual query itself. That's the way I like to think about it. So we'll say command text, and then this one is going to say, where does this data live within this particular worksheet? Well, it lives in our table. And so what we're going to do is we're going to say, basically take this little section right here, and we're just going to add something onto it. So we're going to say, hey, go to this file, and then go to this data table in this particular file. Now, remember, I changed the name of my data table, so it's sales data. So I just need to pass through the name of my table. Okay, and then from here, we need to specify the command type, or in a sense, the query type. And we'll say, in this example, it's Excel command, Excel. So it's an Excel query. Next one is create model connection. So do we want to create a connection to our Power Pivot model? Yes, we do. So I'm going to put true, comma, underscore, next line, and then we want import relationships. So sometimes the data source that we're working with already has relationships predefined for us. For example, Access Database, SQL Server. We might have relationships there already predefined. Now, in our example, we don't have any relationships predefined, so it doesn't matter what we put in, but by default, it will be true. So we just leave it like that. What is going on? Oh, I forgot my comma up here. So remember, description, comma, space, underscore. Perfect. Everyone's happy now. So this is our connection. This is going to create a new connection to our Power Pivot model. We should be good to go. So I'm going to run this. Oh, sorry. It's not names, it's name. Let's run it again. Perfect. So it added a connection to our Power Pivot model. So I'm going to go back to my workbook. I'm going to go to my data tab. I'm going to go to manage data model. And then here we go. Here is our data set loaded into Power Pivot. Good. Now that we've loaded it, let's create a new measure inside of our data table. So I'm going to go back here. I'm going to comment this out because we already have our data in there, so I don't need to run it again. But now what we're going to do is we're going to first create a reference to Power Pivot itself. So create a reference to Power Pivot. And so what we're going to do is we're going to set the my model variable equal to this workbook. And we're going to go into the model property. This will basically create that reference for us. So we're saying reference the model in this workbook. Now that we've done that, we're going to create a measure. But we need to specify where this measure is going to belong. So, well, what I'm about to do, technically, you don't have to do it like this. I think it's easier. What I like to do is create a reference to the table that I want to put the measure in. And then when I create the measure, I just pass through that reference. I think it's a little bit easier. I think it's easier to kind of follow. So I'm just going to do it like that. So we're going to create a reference to the table. We want to add the measure. And so we're going to say set my model table. We're going to go and make that equal to my model. We're going to go into model tables. So the model tables collection. I'm going to go to the item method, and then I can pass through either the index or the name of my table. Well, I'm going to pass through the name of my table. And it's called sales data because when you load a table into Power Pivot, it simply takes the name of the table that you have in our list object. So this one right here, it just carried that over and it added it to the model table itself. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's create a reference to the measures collection, so the model measures collection, and then we'll call the add method to add a new measure. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create a reference to the model measures collection. Now, again, you don't technically have to do it like this, but I want to try to put as many examples out there of showing how you need to reference these things if you need to, so that way you get some examples out there right away. And so what we're going to do is we're going to say set my model measures equal to my model, and then there's a measures, sorry, not measures, it's model measures. And then from here, what we can do is we can now add a new measure to this collection because right now there's none. And so we're going to add a new measure. And so I'm going to say go into my model measures. I'm going to call add. And then there's a couple of parameters I need to pass through. The first one is the measure name, colon equal. I'll call it total transaction count, comma, space, underscore, tab, tab, tab. And then we're going to say associated table. And so from what I've been able to understand, this is the table it belongs to. Or basically where this measure is going to be pulling the data from. Well, it's coming from my model table. So the one that I declare up here, it's coming from the sales data table. So I'm going to put comma, space, underscore, and then we need the formula to calculate this particular measure. And so it's going to be colon equal, it's a string, and then it's going to be sum, sales data, and then the field that we want to sum, which is transaction. So kind of similar to how we did it with a pivot table, but now we're just working with it inside of Power Pivot. I'm going to move that up a little bit, put a comma, space, underscore, and then we have format information. This is basically the data type of our particular measure. At least that's what I've been able to determine. So this is where it gets a little confusing because this is not clear. This is actually an object in its own sense. So it's a model format type. And so we actually have to go into our Power Pivot model object and then specify what the model format is. And so how we do that is we go to My Model, and then if you go down to Model Format, these are all the potential data types that you can use. So there's general, percentage number, scientific number, whole number, decimal number. In this example, I'm just going to put decimal number. So now this particular measure will have the format of a decimal number and the data type of a decimal number. And then from here, comma, space, underscore, and then we can pass through a description. And then it's colon equal, and then we can just say, this is a summary of my total transaction count, period. And then just like that, that's all the parameters that we need to pass through. If we run it now, it should create that new measure for us. And so if I press run, I probably misspelled something. Associated, that's why. It's IA. Let's run it again. Perfect. So it added it. Doesn't let you know if anything happened, but it did run. So if I go here, I go back to my data model. If you look right down here in this little section, if I open that up, I'll see total transaction count and the formula. And you'll also notice that it is of the format decimal number. These are potentially all the ones that we can have. Now, a lot of people might ask, like, well, how do I create a measure to begin with, right? It's not necessarily clear. There's a couple different ways that we can do it. One of them is right up here. If you go to calculations on the home tab, these are basically technically measures that you can add. So if you wanted to, you could say do the max, and then it will do the maximum of the column that you have selected. So it'll say, hey, what's the maximum of the time? That's one way to do it. Not necessarily saying that's the smart way to do it, but that's one way. And then if you close this out and you go to the actual Power Pivot tab itself, if you go under calculations, click this one down, you can actually say new measure. You can name it, measure name, description. Well, sorry, not measure name. This is table name, so where it's going. Name of the measure, description, the formula, and then the data type as well. So that's the other way to do it. I kind of like this way better because I think it's just setting you kind of up for success better and it's letting you control more. So I prefer this method. Okay. So that does it for today's video. I'm going to kind of cut it off there. I know that was a lot of information, but if you have any kind of initial questions about how to use Power Pivot, the model object inside of VBA, please put those questions down in the comments below. I'll try to get back to you and help you through that. I understand this is probably very confusing at first for some people. I know for me, when I was trying to understand this, it was really challenging just because there was no examples or any of that. So again, I'm going to try to put as many examples out there. I might make my code a little bit unnecessarily longer because it's just demonstrating how to do more things. So I just want to make sure people see a different variety of how we're putting stuff in there. So yeah, we'll put out more videos, trust me. Also, if you could make sure to like the video, we really appreciate the support. We want to make sure other people can find this video, and get familiar with the new object model out there. And then also, if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel so that way you get regular updates as we release new videos. So thanks again for watching, guys. We will see you in the next video.